The U.S. so-called Summit for Democracy featured many far-right authoritarian regimes. I did a video talking about how, for instance, the authoritarian corrupt regime in Ukraine, where Nazis are part of the National Guard officially, was invited. Ukraine, the corrupt regime that imprisoned the opposition leader, that shut down critical media outlets, or the far-right regime in Poland, which, I mean, the only reason it was invited to the U.S. so-called Democracy Summit is because it's anti-Russian and it's a member of the EU and NATO and very pro-Western. Also, I mentioned that India, the far-right regime of Narendra Modi and the BJP, the Hindu nationalist regime, was also invited to participate. Bolivia, the great democratic, and I'm not being sarcastic, the actual democracy in Bolivia that defeated a US-backed coup regime was not invited, of course. Bolivia was not, but the fascist regime of Bolsonaro in Brazil was invited to the so-called Summit for Democracy. And then finally, the topic of this segment, the far-right corrupt narco-regime in Colombia, a corrupt regime led by Ivan Duque, the pupil and flunky of the drug lord and death squad sponsor Alvaro Uribe. That regime was invited to the so-called Summit for Democracy. Meanwhile, back at home in Colombia, we've seen a skyrocketing number of massacres. And this happens every single year. This is not new, but you never see it reported in mainstream corporate media. So here is a report that was just published only in Spanish language media. Again, you're not going to see this mentioned in English language corporate media. This is in Nodal, NODAL, which is stands for News from Latin America and the Caribbean. The headline, Colombia, 91 massacres in the year so far, and more than 320 people killed. More than 320, specifically 323 Colombians have been killed in 91 massacres just this year. Today is December 17th. This article is published December 14th. It's possible that Colombia will reach the great honor of 100 massacres this year alone. And last year, the statistics were very similar. Every single year in Colombia, which again was invited to the so-called Summit for Democracy, which is a U.S. client regime, which Washington considers a model for so-called democracy in Latin America. Every single year, hundreds of Colombians are massacred in dozens of bloodbaths, dozens of massacres. This is according to the Observatory of Conflicts, Peace, and Human Rights from the Institute of Studies for Development and Peace, INDEPAZ, which documented 91 massacres with 323 victims. And they talk about the areas in which it happened in the different regions like Cauca and Buga, which is the Valley of Cauca. There were 3 youth who were killed. And they also talk about some of the other massacres and some of the groups. So here are the victims of this most recent massacre include Maria Cristina Velázquez, a 62-year-old woman, and a mother of 2 of the other victims. Jordi Rodrigo Patiño Velázquez, who's 40 years old, and Adier Fernando Rosero Velázquez, who was 20 years old and had Down syndrome. So we're talking about a family who was massacred, including a 62-year-old mother and her 2 children, including one of her children who is a 20-year-old suffering from Down syndrome, a disabled person. I mean, this is the kind of bloodshed we're talking about on a regular basis. But this is the model that Washington hopes to impose on Latin America. And let's not forget, Colombia is a neighbor of Venezuela. So scary. The so-called dictatorship, supposedly. No, the reality is that while the Western corporate media and the US government and its flunkies constantly smear Venezuela falsely as a dictatorship, it is much more democratic than the actual narco-regime, the actual dictatorship in Colombia, a blood-soaked monstrosity where hundreds of people are massacred every single year.